Suffering can be broken down into two categories, that of primary suffering and also that of secondary suffering. And when I use the term suffering, that can mean things that we very typically would define as suffering, such as pain, but it can also mean the dissatisfaction we feel throughout our lives. So it can be the dissatisfaction of things not being the way that we want them to be. So let's unpack this teaching of primary and secondary suffering a little bit more. So these teachings come from the Buddhist tradition. You may have heard the story of the two arrows, and I'll put a link to that in the caption below for in case you want to read a bit more about it. This teaching is then used in the Mindfulness for Health program through Breathworks to really support people experiencing long-term health conditions. So let's come back to that idea of primary and secondary suffering. So primary suffering is the immediate sensory impact that we are feeling. So this could be the physical sensations of pain, the feeling of heaviness and lethargy that comes with fatigue. So these are things that we don't have any control over. Secondary suffering is then about our emotions, our feelings, our memories, our predictions and our actions in response to that initial layer of suffering. So for example, this could be thinking, oh no, what's going to happen if this doesn't end? Or starting to create certain narratives, ideas around what might happen in our mind's eye. So I've run an 8-week introduction to mindfulness class in the past, and I used the following example with groups, and most people found it really helpful. So let's have a look at the lens of primary and secondary suffering through an example that I think many of us can relate to, and that's being caught in traffic. So the primary suffering here could be that initial realization that we're going to be late. And with that, we'll have some bodily based responses. So there could be that spike of cortisol, which we may feel as anger. We may feel it as a tensing, a bracing in our body. Our breath might become uncomfortable, it might feel unpleasant, we might feel pangs around, okay, what will someone think of me? What am I letting someone down? So this can be the primary suffering, and when we think about this, those immediate responses are quite immediate. So noticing actually, okay, what's going on at that body-based level. Secondary suffering is often the initial distress that we add to that primary layer. So if we think we've got that initial rush of adrenaline and cortisol that, oh no, I'm going to be late, the discomfort that that creates. But then with our secondary suffering, we might start to feel nervous about calling, say, our boss, the person that we're supposed to be meeting, to let them know that we're late. Before we've even dialed the number, we might be preempting their response. We might be thinking, oh no, they're going to tell me off or be disappointed in me. We then might start berating ourselves for being caught in traffic. We might say, oh no, this is my fault. I should have set off half an hour earlier. I'm always late. What if I'd taken a different route? Etc, etc. So there's so many thoughts that we can add here. We might remember a time a few weeks ago when we were late, when we were caught in traffic again, and how uncomfortable that was, how it might have taken far longer than we'd expected. Again, we're remembering this and we're reliving it to a certain level in our bodies. So this is creating that loop where we're keeping that cortisol and that adrenaline firing. We're keeping ourselves in a stress response. We then might start catastrophizing. So thinking, okay, what if my boss doesn't believe me? What if they then remember that I didn't do so well at that report that I submitted last month, or I felt that my presentation was a little bit weak? What if I end up losing my job? And then we can very quickly go into a full stream of catastrophizing thoughts over what if, each time our mind coming to that worst case scenario. If it's a friend, we might think, okay, what if they feel like I don't care? What if they don't want to meet up with me again? And again, we can see how those worst case scenarios start playing out. So I think this gives you a little bit of an example. And when we frame it like this, when we notice those additional layers, so that primary suffering or dissatisfaction, and then that secondary level, it can be really helpful for us to see, okay, where do I have control? So we might have no control over that primary level of suffering. And with that, we can use our energy, our tools to support ourselves, to steady ourselves in the midst of that challenge. And we can do this rather than going to what often is a natural response, a natural reaction, where we start overthinking, overanalyzing, and perhaps worrying about all those what ifs. These things generally don't serve us. They simply amplify our stress responses further, and our bodies continue to live that because our minds and our bodies are not separate. We're completely as one. So when we can kindly notice that we've gone into secondary suffering, we can come back to the primary suffering, take care of that, and then people generally find that that moves through a little quicker. So we're not adding to that discomfort, we're tending to that discomfort and allowing this to move. We're accepting where we have control and where we don't have control. And that doesn't mean that we need to love this, but it helps us act and support ourselves more skillfully. So that's a little bit of information about this concept of primary and secondary suffering here. I'd love to know how this resonates for you. And yes, do ask me any questions in the comments below, or you can contact me over on Instagram. So thanks so much for listening.